To Mmusi Maimane. He is the leader, or is that chief activist? I think he calls himself chief activist for the One SA movement. Mmusi, good afternoon to you. And tell me, my colleague, just making the point, how do we assess how independents did? And what you really want to see is how many wards they've won. Yeah. How well do you think they did?
I think they did exceptionally well. If independents in this country were a party nationally, they'd be the fifth biggest, right? We've been able to garner, just as part of the whole independent cohort, just over 600,000 votes. The big trick is now to break it down to what happens in municipalities. And the scoreboard won't be able to tell you what happened in Section 15A organizations. So what I'm grateful for is that you'll have an independent mayor in Cedarburg. You'll have negotiations in Neisner. You'll have changes taking place in Inokmgijima. So I can point to many municipalities in Setoto, in places like Mopani. So there are pockets across the country where independents have done extraordinarily well. So to me, I think you've got to look at it and say, have they grown nationally? Yes. Have they been able to have an influence in councils that are sitting across the country where many of them are hung? Yes. And thirdly, have we increased the number of seats? I think yes. So I would argue the case. This election, certainly the independents have done extraordinarily well.
Look, every leader I've spoken to who sat in that chair has said they've done very well.
Yeah.
Even I shouldn't be so horrible, even Cope. I must say, though, so the reason that you're not expressed as a party is because you aren't a party.
Correct.
Right? So independents probably agree, I would imagine, on several things. They want better service delivery. That's probably usually why. They want better things for their community. Generally speaking, their community is rewarding them for that, because so far as it doesn't conflict with another community. In other words, that there's no trade-off that needs to be made. But that doesn't mean that you agree on everything. So what happens from here is really the question, because it's fine to say independents in these 3 wards in a city, won 3 wards, let's just say Joburg for argument's sake, but that doesn't mean they actually agree on everything, or even very much.
No, certainly. But I think there are two, at a philosophical level, I think South Africans are entering into what I would call post-ideological, post-liberation era. So you cannot coalesce around ideology, because I think we're now heading towards, let's change from liberation politics. I think we're done with the big parties. We're done with the ANC liberation moment. How do we move on from there? Secondly, we have common values that we share as humanity. And one of the things I philosophically try to work towards is how do we re-entrench Ubuntu across society? Because that value sits in all of us. To say, I see humanity. Now you might say, how does that work economically? Then you have to say to yourself, well, it can't be crass corruption. Or it can't be corruption at all because you're stealing from someone. It can't, an education system that favors Ubuntu starts to change. And countries, particularly Nordic countries who have seen development around this area, have anchored themselves around values. So to me, I think that's the journey towards 2024. Can you coalesce around values? Can you coalesce around a plan for government? And then can you transition from post-liberation politics? That, to me, is a powerful and compelling offer heading towards 2024. So I'm confident about it.
So like it's a good job that you're selling here. I mean, I'm a customer, I'm a voter, I'm sort of almost willing to buy. But here's a problem, and I've seen, you'll know the analyst Ibrahim Fakir. And he's not the first person to say this, but he's certainly someone I've seen say it. Which is one of the problems with the post-ideology politics. And I think a post-ideological politics is very attractive. I mean, just make the water work. Just fix Eskom, like some of the stuff, I mean, it's not simple, but it's easy to agree on. The problem with post-ideology politics is that it can become very transactional. So Gayton McKenzie was sitting in that chair yesterday. You and he are very different people, I accept that. And he was saying, he's going to come and clap me later. But he would say he would go with whoever gives his people, his voters, the best deal. Now, he said he would do a deal with the RBB if it was still going. I mean, I find that reprehensible, but that's just me. The problem is that with independence, if you have a post-ideological era, isn't that the risk that it becomes very transactional and then it becomes based on patronage? And isn't that really the risk of a post-ideological era?
I think we must recognize, using the term post-ideological might mean, what I mean is perhaps maybe post-party ideological space. Because let me put it to you this way. Part of the challenge of independence is that they shouldn't be independent of communities. Communities have needs, especially at local government, which is far less ideological in and of itself. The infrastructure we've got to build now, and we've been working on it, is to say, let communities be able to vote. So if you become a candidate who becomes highly transactional in selling your vote to whoever is the highest bidder, the community must penalize you. The problem with South Africa is that all the big parties have become elitist, let alone ideological, elitist. So what the net consequence of that is, the voter doesn't have a voice. The voter cannot participate in that process. So let's bring it back to citizens, let them have a voice, let them be able to exercise their vote continuously to hold people accountable. Now read the plan, because you use ESCOM as a really good example. When we get to national coalitions, we've seen that actually globally, the political system has delivered what others would, and it's been a maturing development. People like Wing Chang have come with economics that say, let's find a new way, let's find a third way, let's find, others have to find it as, let's be pragmatic.
Sure.
Because I think if you can articulate that plan, suddenly, as a citizen, you wouldn't be selling your vote in a transactional thing for the benefit of the party, as Mr. McKenzie says, to my people. Suddenly you are sticking to a plan and say, here's a genuinely new deal for South Africa, here's the plan, the right leadership, then you can take citizens forward.
One of your, and I don't want to misquote you, so let me put my assessment, let me put what I think you're trying to do, is one of the things you want to do ahead of 2024 is the implementation of the Constitutional Court judgment, which says that there must be a change in independence, so individuals on their own can run in Parliament. Am I right to assume that following that, you're looking at a system of geographic constituencies like you would have in the United Kingdom? In other words, to use the old example, Helen Suzman would represent Houghton, so in this case, Mmusi Maimane would represent Meadowlands, for example. That's what you want. And I think following on from that, it's an accountability argument, right? And I would say, to add to what you're saying, that the reason the voters have, if I may, punished the ANC, particularly in a place like eThekwini, where I never thought the ANC would lose in this election, is because the ANC has not introduced accountability for its members. And I think that's part of the message of this election. So here's my question after that very long explanation, which is, I'm not convinced that having a constituency democracy actually introduces accountability, because a constituency democracy ends up in Congress people in the United States who get away with an awful lot. The one in Britain ends up with Boris Johnson, who no one can hold accountable of anything, it seems, and that actually you might find that you don't get the accountability that you're looking for.
There are two issues. One, it's often very difficult to compare democracies in different timelines. The US democracy is at a maturation point, really, and I think we've got to say to ourselves, 30 years on, as will be the case in 2024, what works and what doesn't work, and I think clearly the current isn't working, because how do you have Zondo Commission with a PR system? It means majoritarianism then takes place, so there's a failure there. So the second issue is, how do we then, once we infuse that accountability, perhaps find different models? One of our problems is when I talk about state capture, we use the old selling mechanism, buy one, get one free. So in the last era, you bought the president and got the whole party for free. Now, if you were to buy one in a constituency-based model, you couldn't get the rest for free, because you'd only have that one. So we would be able to break state capture. Furthermore, I think one of the great challenges, and there's a great book at the moment out by Poor Economics, which looks at globally what citizens understand political principles to be able to do. And in fairness, people don't know what politicians do. And our system is a bit of a hybrid in that it gives constituency offices, etc. Let's repurpose that for the very purpose they were set up for, which is a constituency-based model, so that when you are demanding a school, a hospital, which are competences of national government, you can go there. Then the last thing I would argue, the strength in America, now to almost do what I advise you not to, the presidential direct election. Zambia is an excellent example of that. Here, for the first time, the Liberation Party there has lost votes, doesn't exist. Kenneth Kaunda's party is nowhere to be spoken of. But young people came back and said, I either back Hakainde Hichilema or Edgar Lungu. 2024, wouldn't it be great in South Africa if we were able to sit back and say, I either back Mmusi Maimane, Julius Malema, or Cyril Ramaphosa? That gives a different accountability, because now you're not choosing cabinet on the back of party patronage, you're choosing it for the people.
So yes and no. So in Zambia, the new president had to also put a lot of people from other parties in his cabinet, because he was running on behalf of other parties, because he was a candidate for more than one, because it was the only way to beat the incumbent. And the same thing would happen here, I would suggest. But there's another possibility that worries me. Don't get me wrong, I'm finding as many holes in your argument as I can, because I think it's a very attractive argument. And wouldn't the problem not be that the current system of proportional representation, Anthony Butler, you'll know Professor Anthony Butler has written about this, so has Johnny Steinberg, who I take very seriously, that the current system forces you to stitch together national coalitions, which the ANC has done very well. The closest we've seen to that is the DA. Now, what you would have is if you have direct elections, you win with 50+1. So it's very easy to do it along maybe race lines, I don't know if that would work, maybe language lines, ethnicity lines, class lines, and you end up with a president who wins 50+1, so it doesn't govern for everybody. Is that not the risk?
Of course there are risks to any system, but I do think let's reverse back and say, at this point in time in the system as you've described it, you've got post-coalitions. Sure. And that doesn't mean that they don't happen along racial lines, religious lines, etc. What we need is pre-coalitions. So that if I'm sitting in KwaZulu-Natal, I say the best candidate is from that party. Let everybody step back and let the voters know they are voting for that candidate, because on the basis of a pre-agreement, we're not being duped post facto. We know up front what we're voting for. And I think, to me, at least the appeal is pre-coalitions for the purpose of the long-term democratic project. Is a powerful, compelling argument to be able to bring about the change in this country. Otherwise, the ANC will win forever.
2024, is the ANC out of power?
Completely. And I'm convinced that they've dipped below 45%, very difficult to reverse once you do that. And I think nationally, South Africans are saying we're rejecting liberation movements. I think we'll be in a post-ANC democracy in 2024.
Mmusi Maimane, thanks very much indeed. The chief activist of the One South Africa movement. Plenty more to come here from the Results Operations Centre. Don't forget the proclamation of the election. The official ceremony starts at 6 o'clock. More in a moment.